She announced it at the dinner table, between the salad and the main course, the way someone might mention they'd run out of olive oil. "I just want everyone to know," my mother said, setting down her wine glass with that practiced little click she does, "that Riley will not be giving a speech at Danielle's wedding. We've decided it's better that way." I was sitting 3 feet from her. She did not look at me once. That was the moment. Not the worst one. There had been worse, and you'll hear about them. But the one I keep coming back to because of what happened next, which was nothing. My stepfather, Dennis, cut his chicken. Danielle's fiancé, Brett, studied the centerpiece. Danielle herself laughed the soft, embarrassed laugh she always produces when something needs to not exist anymore. And I sat there with my fork in my hand, watching my mother reach for the breadbasket as if she had just confirmed the weather. 2 weeks later, I showed up at that wedding. I sat in the third row and watched my sister walk down the aisle in a dress I had helped pay for. When the reception began, when the speeches were flowing and the champagne was poured and my mother was laughing her loudest laugh at the head table, I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope I had been carrying since that morning. I set it on the gift table between a crystal vase and a card with pink ribbons. Then I walked to the microphone, which nobody had handed to me, which nobody expected me to touch, and I spoke. And when I finished speaking, the room went so quiet you could hear the ice shifting in the drink buckets. My mother had gone the color of the tablecloth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you who we all are first. My name is Riley Brown, and I'm 34 years old. I live in Cloverfield, Ohio, in a house with yellow shutters that I painted myself one October weekend because I wanted the house to look like it belonged to someone who actually lived there. I work as a project coordinator for a mid-sized construction firm, which means I spend my days ensuring that other people's decisions have real-world consequences, which is, now that I think about it, the only kind of work I have ever been good at. I drink my coffee black. I don't cry in front of people if I can help it. I have a dog named Chester who is deeply opinionated about mealtimes. And I have a family that has been teaching me, for as long as I can remember, that love and favoritism can wear the same face for decades before you learn to tell them apart. My mother is Carol. She is 61 years old, small-boned, precise, fond of rule-stating and wine that costs $22 a bottle, which she considers a reasonable indulgence. She has the laugh I mentioned, the one she deploys when something needs to disappear. And she has a talent for announcing the unkind thing in the tone reserved for the obvious thing, which is its own kind of cruelty, the kind that leaves no fingerprints. My stepfather, Dennis, has been in the picture since I was 9. He is not a bad man. He is a quiet man, which is not the same thing, though in that house they functioned identically. Dennis nods. Dennis cuts his food. Dennis agrees that it's better this way. My sister Danielle is 3 years younger than me and has always been her mother's daughter in ways I never managed to be. She is pretty in the way that gets described first and remembered longest. She is warm when warmth costs her nothing. She is not malicious. I want to be clear about that because it would be simpler if she were. She genuinely loves me, I think, in the limited way that people can love someone they have spent their whole lives receiving advantages over. She loves me the way you love a landscape you've stopped noticing. It's always been there. You'd miss it if it were gone, but you've never once stood in front of it and really looked. My partner is Marcus. We have been together for 7 years, and he is, without question, the calmest person I have ever been near. He is an electrician, which means he is good with his hands and better with systems. He understands how things are connected, what happens when a circuit is overloaded, where the real problem usually hides. When I came home from family dinners with that particular look on my face, the one I can't describe but he always recognized immediately, he would pour me a glass of water, set it on the table in front of me, and wait. Not prompt, not push, just wait. I have never properly thanked him for that specific kindness, and I am not sure I know how. My grandmother, my father's mother, Nana Lou, lives 40 minutes south in a yellow brick house on Perkins Street that smells of cedar and a particular brand of hand lotion she has used my entire life. She is 80 years old and has an opinion about everything, and states it without apology and is almost always right. She is the reason this story does not end in a way that would be harder to tell. If you've ever sat at a table where the people around you closed ranks and pretended they did not see what just happened, if you've ever been the one in the room that everyone decided not to look at, then you already understand why I kept sitting in that chair for so long. You know the specific quiet that settles over you when you decide that what just happened was probably not as bad as it felt, probably not worth making a scene over, probably something you should let go of because you are reasonable, and that is what reasonable people do. If you know that quiet, stay with me, because I have something to tell you about what is on the other side of it. Subscribe if you want to hear what I did at that wedding. I promise you will not guess it. And if you think what my mother said at that dinner table was wrong, that I should have been silenced at my own sister's celebration, give this a like the second it lands. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been erased at a family event while everyone around you acted like nothing happened? I read every single one. Every single one. My mother's favorite instrument of control was always the rule. Not a harsh rule, not an unfair-sounding rule, a reasonable one, presented calmly, which made it very difficult to argue with and almost impossible to escape. The rules governed everything, but they governed some of us more than others, which was the part that took years to identify because rules, by design, are supposed to apply equally. That is the point of them. That is what makes them feel like justice instead of preference. The first rule I remember noticing was the bedroom rule. When I was 11, my mother established that bedrooms were to be kept clean at all times, defined as visible floor space in every corner, no clothes on the bed during daylight hours, dresser top cleared except for one decorative item of the occupant's choosing. She walked through both rooms on Saturday mornings, and if either room failed inspection, the occupant lost screen time for the week. I followed the rule carefully. I had learned by then that the cost of not following rules was always higher than the cost of following them. Danielle followed the rule for about 3 weeks. Then she stopped. Her room became what 8-year-old girls' rooms become. Clothes on the floor, stuffed animals avalanching off the bed, the dresser buried under lip gloss and sticker collections, and the scattered pieces of a bead bracelet kit she'd never finished. On Saturday morning, I stood in the hallway and watched my mother stop in Danielle's doorway, tilt her head at the disaster inside, and say gently, "Sweetheart, try to keep it a little tidier this week, okay?" Then she walked to my room and ran 2 fingers along the windowsill as if checking for dust. I want to describe what happened in my body in that moment. But angry, isn't it? And confused doesn't cover it. And hurt is too simple. What happened was that something I had believed about the world revealed itself to be optional. Rules I understood were not actually rules. They were systems of expectation applied to specific people. And I was one of those people. And Danielle was not. I did not say this out loud for years. You learn in houses like ours that naming the system is more dangerous than tolerating it. If you say, "But you didn't make Danielle clean her room," what you hear back is, "Danielle is younger," or "Danielle has been having a hard time," or the most devastating one, the one my mother deployed with such comfortable fluency, it must have been true on some level. "You've always been more responsible, Riley. I expect more from you because I know you can handle it." Said as a compliment. Intended as a compliment, maybe. Functioning as a wall. I handled it. That was my role. I handled things. And so, things were given to me to handle, because I could. The parties were where the arithmetic became impossible to ignore. When I turned 13, we had a family dinner. My mother made the pasta bake she makes for birthdays, with the garlic bread from the freezer section of Kroger, and there was a grocery store cake. White frosting, blue flowers, "Happy Birthday, Riley" in the loopy script that the bakery counter staff always writes the same way. 12 people around the table, gifts that were practical, useful, thoughtful, in the way thoughtful becomes when it is trying not to be too much. I said thank you. I meant it. When Danielle turned 10, 2 years later, my mother rented the back room of a restaurant called the Garden Room in downtown Cloverfield. She sent paper invitations with little envelopes. There was a caricature artist. There was a custom birthday banner with Danielle's face on it, printed at a shop in the mall. The cake had 3 tiers, and the bakery spelled out Danielle in spun sugar. My mother wore a dress. There was a playlist. There were favors, small mesh bags filled with candy and a bracelet, and a tiny bottle of nail polish. I helped fill the favor bags the night before, sitting at the kitchen table. Not because I was asked, but because I wanted to be part of something that felt like a celebration, and that was the only version of it available to me. "She's turning 10, my mother explained, to no one in particular while she tied the ribbons on the bags. "It's a big one." I had turned 13. I was not sure what number that was. Over the years, the examples accumulated. Danielle got the bedroom repainted when she decided she no longer liked lavender. First to yellow, then 2 years after that to a warm gray that my mother said looked sophisticated. My room stayed the same dusty blue it had been painted before I was born, with the strip of wallpaper border near the ceiling that had started peeling in the corner by the window and never got fixed. When I mentioned it once, lightly, my mother said the wallpaper border added character. I think I laughed. I am almost certain I laughed. There was the car situation, which deserves its own moment because the car is where the family mythology really crystallized. When Danielle turned 16, there was a red bow. An actual red bow, the kind you see in car commercials, tied to the antenna of a used Nissan Sentra in good condition parked in the driveway, and my mother and Dennis standing beside it with the particular excitement of people who have been waiting to do a thing and are now doing it. Danielle screamed. She ran down the driveway in her socks. She hugged my mother for a long time. When I had turned 16, 2 years before, there had been a conversation about public transit. The bus line in Cloverfield runs adequately. Not beautifully, not conveniently, but adequately. My mother explained that the family couldn't manage a car right now, that things were tight, that the bus would build independence, that many people used the bus, and there was nothing wrong with the bus. I agreed with all of this because all of this was technically true. I took the bus. I took the bus in the dark in January to my job at a coffee shop on the north end of town, and I took the bus home in the dark at 11 at night. And once there was ice, and the bus was 40 minutes late, and I stood under the shelter with my hands inside my jacket and thought about a great many things. Danielle got the red bow. I kept the bus schedule folded in my coat pocket. I want to tell you what my mother said when Danielle pointed this out years later, after a few glasses of wine at a family dinner when the mood was loose enough for almost honesty. Danielle said, half laughing, half surprised to be saying it, "You always preferred the bus, didn't you, Riley?" Not even my mother who said it. Danielle, who had absorbed the story so completely that she told it back to me, as if it were a fact about my personality, rather than a decision that had been made about my life. That sentence cost her nothing. I don't think she knew it cost me anything either. The money situation took longer to name because it arrived so gradually and was always framed as family. That is the important word. Family. When you grow up in a household that uses the word family as a value rather than a description, you learn that family means you don't count things. You don't keep ledgers. You don't notice who paid for what and who benefited from it, and whether the distribution was fair, because noticing those things is the opposite of family, and you very much want to be part of the family. You have always wanted that, even, especially, when the family has made that wanting expensive. It started when I was 24, with my first real paycheck from the construction firm. My mother called and mentioned, in the same easy tone she used for everything, that Dennis had been laid off and things were tight, and would I be able to help with the utilities for a couple of months? I said yes. Of course I said yes. 2 months became 4. 4 became a permanent automatic transfer. $240 a month, labeled in my banking app simply as home help. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself this was what family did. Then came the mortgage stretch of 2019, when Carol mentioned that they were a little behind, and would it be possible, just briefly, to help with part of the payment? That one was $950. Just for 1 month, she said. It lasted 8 months. I watched the transfer go out every first of the month, the way you watch a subscription you forgot to cancel, with faint surprise and no action. Then there was the party fund, which is what I privately named the transfers that began when Danielle got engaged. Brett's family was contributing significantly, my mother explained. They were paying for the venue, the catering, the photographer. But there were still so many things, so many details, and wouldn't it be wonderful to make this perfect? And Riley, you've always been so good at making things work. I started contributing $300 a month to what my mother called the wedding budget, and what I understood, gradually, to be my mother's operating fund with a wedding-shaped justification attached. I also paid for Danielle's dress. Not all of it. My mother paid something toward it too, I think, though I never saw the receipt. But I wrote the check that covered the balance at the bridal boutique on Maple Street, $480. because the appointment was running over and the boutique was closing, and my mother looked at me with that particular expression that is not quite a request because she has never learned to actually ask. I wrote the check. The consultant folded it into the register without looking at me. The month before the wedding, I opened my banking app on a Tuesday night while Chester was asleep on my feet and Marcus was reading in the other room, and I went through the previous 12 months. The utilities transfer running continuously, $2,880. The mortgage stretches across 3 separate periods, $7,600. The wedding fund transfers, monthly for 14 months, $4,200. The dress, $480. Various smaller contributions. The bridal shower cake I ordered. The bachelorette dinner I covered when 2 guests canceled at the last minute and left a gap. The rehearsal dinner wine that my mother said she'd pay me back for. Another $860 approximate. I added it up 3 times. I came to the same number each time. $30 shy of $16,000. In 12 months. I set the phone face down on the cushion beside me and listened to Chester breathe. That was the moment I stopped making excuses for them. Not with anger. There was no explosion, no revelation, no sudden rage. Just a stillness. The particular stillness of someone who has finished adding up a column of numbers and received a clear answer. And then there was the thing at dinner. The announcement. The dinner table, the salad course, the wine glass set down with a click. Riley will not be giving a speech at Danielle's wedding. We've decided it's better that way. And the forks cutting, and the bread basket moving, and my sister's soft, embarrassed laugh, and Dennis studying the chicken on his plate, as if it contained some crucial information he'd been waiting to find. I did not make a scene. I folded my napkin. I ate my dinner. I said goodnight. I woke up the next morning to the specific quality of light that comes through my bedroom window in early October. Thin, a little gold, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is. The coffee maker was running. Chester was sitting by the window with the particular posture of a dog who has been waiting patiently for someone to acknowledge that he exists. I sat on the edge of the bed, and the first thing I noticed was the silence in my own chest. Not emptiness. Something more deliberate. Something that had made a decision while I was sleeping. Marcus came in with 2 mugs. He set mine on the nightstand and sat in the chair by the window and looked at me the way he does when he is waiting without rushing. I said, "I'm done." He said, "Okay." He didn't ask done with what. He knew what. He had known for a long time, probably longer than I had, because Marcus understands circuits and he had watched this one overloading for years. I said, "I'm going to the wedding, but I'm going differently than they expect." He nodded. He drank his coffee. He did not tell me what to do. He has never told me what to do, which is one of the primary reasons I trust him completely. I sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours that morning with my laptop and my phone and a notepad. I was not crying. I was not shaking. I was doing what I am good at, coordinating, identifying the moving parts, deciding what goes where and when and what the correct sequence is. Project management, essentially, applied to my own life, which was overdue. The banking app was the first stop. I scrolled to the recurring transfers and I opened the first one, the utilities transfer, $240 monthly, running for 9 years. And I canceled it. The app asked me to confirm. I confirmed, then the mortgage support, which was technically inactive at that moment, but had a reactivation set up for the following month. I removed it. Then the wedding fund, which had one final transfer scheduled for the 15th. I removed it too. I did it with the same focus I bring to a project deadline, methodically, without narration, click, confirm, click, confirm. 5 years of accumulated obligation dismantled in under 4 minutes and a fingerprint scan. I felt the strange lightness of that. Not joy. Something quieter. The feeling of a bag set down after a long walk. Then I opened a new document and I started writing. Not a speech. What I was writing was not a speech. It was a letter. It was addressed to Danielle, and to the room, and honestly to myself, and it had been composing itself in some part of my mind for approximately 9 years. And the sentences came out already formed, already clean, already at the right temperature. I wrote for 40 minutes. I read it back once. I did not change very much. I printed it on the good paper, the cream-colored 90-pound stock I keep in the desk for important documents. And I folded it in thirds, and I put it in the envelope I had bought the week before from the stationery shop on River Street, the kind with a peel and seal strip that makes a satisfying sound when it closes. I wrote Danielle's name on the front in my own handwriting, which is neat and slightly old-fashioned, which people always comment on. Then I set the envelope in my bag beside my keys and my lipstick and the small tube of hand cream that Nana Lou gave me last Christmas that smells like oranges and something faintly medicinal. The timing was the part I had thought about most carefully. Not because I am vindictive, I want to be honest about this, because the distinction matters, but because I understood that timing is how meaning is communicated in situations where words have been taken from you. If the letter arrived the day before the wedding, it could be intercepted, managed, folded into one of my mother's narratives. If it arrived after, it would be context-free. It needed to land at the moment of maximum clarity, when the room was assembled, when the occasion was at its height, when everyone who had ever witnessed this family's particular brand of quiet was present, watching. That moment was the reception, after the ceremony, after the vows, after the photographs, when the speeches were supposed to happen. The best man, the maid of honor, the father of the bride, Dennis rising with his prepared remarks printed on index cards. That was when I would walk to the microphone, when the room was warm and full and attentive and nobody was expecting me. The day of the wedding, I woke up at 6 and made eggs. Chester sat beside the stove and supervised. Marcus drove us to the venue, the Hillcrest Event Center on Route 9, a beige building with good catering and a parking lot that always has gravel-colored puddles regardless of whether it has recently rained. I wore a green dress and my grandmother's earrings. I carried my bag with the letter in it. I felt the whole drive there, the way I imagine surgeons feel before a procedure they have done many times and done well. Focused, clear, not nervous exactly, but precise. The ceremony was beautiful. Danielle was radiant. Genuinely radiant, the way people are on days they have been looking forward to for years. Brett cried during his vows, which I respected. I sat in the third row and I watched, and I felt, underneath everything, a real and uncomplicated love for my sister that has nothing to do with the rest of this, and everything to do with the fact that she is my sister, and I have known her my whole life. And she walked down that aisle and she was happy. That is true. And I need you to know it is true. At the reception, I placed the envelope on the gift table. Then I waited. I ate the appetizers. The crab cakes were very good. I talked to Brett's aunt, who collects vintage quilts and has interesting opinions. I watched my mother work the room in the way she does. Arms open, laugh deployed, moving from cluster to cluster like someone tending to an installation she had built. When Dennis finished his index card speech and the room was still clapping, I stood up. I walked to the front. The event coordinator started toward me with the politely questioning look of someone whose job is to prevent exactly this kind of interruption. I smiled at her and said, "Just one moment." Something in my face apparently communicated that this was not negotiable because she stepped back. I took the microphone. The room settled. My mother's face went from surprise to the particular expression that means she is computing a threat. I looked at Danielle and I said, "Danielle, I love you. You know that. I'm going to say some things in this room that I should have said years ago. And I'm going to say them here because here is the only place where no one can decide they weren't said." The room was completely still. I said what I had written. Not word for word. I know the letter well enough that I didn't need the page. But the shape of it, the weight of it. I talked about the dress on Maple Street. I talked about the wedding fund. I talked about $16,000 in 12 months, and the utilities and the mortgage stretches, and what family means when it only runs in one direction. I talked about a dinner table where I had been told, without a meeting or a conversation, or the courtesy of a private moment, that I was not welcome at the microphone. And I said, so I came to the microphone anyway. That's what I do. I talked about what I was not going to do anymore, which I stated simply and without drama, because I have learned that drama is the thing they use to dismiss you. I was not dramatic. I was clear. I said, I paid for a lot of this wedding. I'm glad I did it, Danielle, because I love you, and love shows up. But I won't be paying for the next one. Then I looked at my mother. And I think you should figure out what you'd like to do about that. I set the microphone back on the stand. I walked back to my seat. My heels were silent on the carpet. The room found its voice again slowly, in increments, the way sound returns after a very loud noise. I heard Danielle say something to Brett that I couldn't make out. I heard my mother's chair scrape back. I picked up my crab cake fork and ate the last bite I hadn't finished, and it was still good. My phone rang while I was still sitting at the reception table. I did not answer. It rang again. I set it face down beside my water glass and watched the screen light up through the back of the case, twice, 3 times. Marcus put his hand over mine on the table. He didn't say anything. He looked at the centerpiece, an arrangement of white roses and eucalyptus that was actually quite lovely, the way someone looks at something that is the only safe thing in a room. I answered on the 4th call, which came 20 minutes after I'd left the venue. We were in the car, Marcus driving, the parking lot lights moving past the windows in long orange stripes. My mother's voice was not her dinner table voice. It was the other one, compressed, fast, slightly too high. She wanted to know what I thought I was doing. She wanted to know if I had lost my mind. She wanted to know what people thought of me right now, what I had done to this family, what Brett's family must think. I let her finish that part. There was more. I let her finish that part too. Then I said, I know you got the automated notifications from the bank. The transfers are canceled. All of them. Pause. That's not a conversation. It's information. She said that I couldn't do this. I said that I already had. She said I was being selfish. I said, I spent 9 years being the opposite of selfish, Mom. You saw what it cost me. You just decided the math was fine. She shifted strategy then. The voice changed again, softened, went to the place where guilt lives. She said I was breaking up the family. She said she didn't know who I was anymore. She said I had humiliated her in front of everyone she knew. I said, I love you, but I'm gonna hang up now. I hung up. The silence after it was the most complete I had ever felt. Not empty, inhabited. Full of something that had finally been allowed to take up its proper space. Marcus drove without speaking, and I watched the fields outside the window go dark, and I understood that I had done the irreversible thing, and that the irreversible thing had needed doing, and that both of those facts were true at the same time and could coexist without resolving. By the following morning, the calls had begun arriving from elsewhere. The first was from my Aunt Patricia, my mother's older sister, who said the word disappointed 4 times in 3 minutes. The second was from my cousin Josh, who wanted to know what had gotten into me. The third was from a woman named Barbara, who attended my mother's church and had apparently heard something from someone and wanted to let me know she was praying for our family. I answered the first 2 out of a reflex I have been trying to retrain for years. The reflex that says a ringing phone is a moral obligation. Barbara, I let go to voicemail. The pattern was predictable once you recognized it. They fill the air with their version before the truth has time to get there on its own. My mother is very good at this. She has had decades of practice. By the time any neutral party hears what happened, the story has already arrived, shaped, softened, reframed, so that the reasonable-sounding center is her and the extreme-sounding edges are me. The version that circulated, as best I could reconstruct it, was that I had staged an outburst at my sister's wedding because I was jealous and had always been difficult, and that the financial information I mentioned was exaggerated or misrepresented, and that the family was devastated. This is a tight narrative. It is designed to be. It does not leave much room. I answered 6 calls total. My answers were the same across all 6. Brief, factual, unembellished. I said what happened in sequence without interpretation. I said the amounts. I said the dates. I said the word documented, which is true. I have records, transfers, receipts, text messages where my mother uses the word temporary approximately 17 times across 3 separate requests. Then I said I was glad they called and I hoped they were well and I had to go. The 7th call came from my cousin Vera, my father's side, the branch that stays at some distance from my mother's family by mutual unspoken agreement, who said, I heard, and what she said at that dinner table was not okay. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. I held the phone and felt something I can only describe as settling, the sensation of a fact being confirmed that you had been half convinced you had invented. Vera had been told the dinner table announcement independently by a different person. and had the same response I'd had. That was enough. More than enough. You spend years wondering if you are imagining things, and then one sentence from one person in one phone call tells you that you were not, and the whole machinery of self-doubt loses just enough traction to slow down. The invoice arrived on a Tuesday in a standard white envelope with a return address I didn't recognize at first, something called Hillcrest Event Services LLC, which I placed after a moment as the management company for the venue where Danielle's wedding had been held. Inside was a single page, itemized charges, professional layout, my name in the billing contact field. Riley Brown listed as responsible party for a remaining balance of $2,320 covering audio and lighting services, event coordination add-ons, and what was listed as extended venue use. Payment due within 30 days. I sat with this document for 60 seconds. I read it 3 times. I turned it over to see if there was anything on the back. There wasn't. I put it down on the table and went and got Chester's leash and took him around the block because I needed fresh air in the specific way that means if I don't get fresh air in the next 5 minutes, I will say something in the wrong tone to the wrong person. When I came back, I called the number on the letterhead. The person who answered sounded tired in the way of someone who processes other people's conflicts all day. I explained calmly that I had not signed any contract with Hillcrest Event Services, that I had not authorized any services on behalf of any event, and that my name had been placed in their system without my knowledge or consent. I asked, politely, for my name to be removed from the account. The person put me on hold for 4 minutes. When she came back, she said there had been a form submitted with my name as a second billing contact for the event, which had been submitted by the primary contact. She gave me the process for disputing it. I said thank you and wrote down the reference number. I disputed it. I was not listed on any contract. My name was removed within 6 business days. I did not call my mother to discuss this. The invoice told me everything the invoice needed to tell me. It told me that the strategy had shifted from emotional appeal to administrative maneuvering. That when the first method of maintaining the arrangement failed, the next method was being attempted immediately, efficiently, without apparent embarrassment. This is why they liked the arrangement. They had grown accustomed to having a name they could list, a person whose compliance they could assume. I was easy to put on a form because for a very long time, I had behaved like someone who had agreed to be on the form. The visit happened on a Saturday. I heard the car in the driveway and looked out the front window and saw my mother's silver Accord, and behind it, Dennis's truck, which meant this was not a spontaneous call. There are 2 cars in Dennis's household, and they take both of them somewhere only when they want the arrival to look final. Danielle was in the back seat of the Accord. I did not see Brett, which surprised me, and then, on reflection, did not. I went to Emma's room. Emma is our neighbor's daughter, 8 years old, who Chester is deeply devoted to and who was over for the afternoon because her parents had errands. I told Emma that some people were visiting, and could she take Chester to the backyard and play the fetch games she and Chester like, and I would come get them when the visit was done. Emma, who is perceptive in the way of children who have spent a lot of time around adult conversations, said okay and took Chester's leash with the seriousness of someone entrusted with an important mission. Marcus was in the kitchen when I came back through. He looked at me. I said, "Stay close, but don't come out unless I ask." He said, okay. He understood the assignment. I opened the front door before they knocked. My mother had her chin up, which is what she does when she is prepared for opposition. Dennis stood slightly behind her to her left, hands in his jacket pockets. Danielle stood to the right with her arms crossed in a way that I think she intended to read as composed, but read as afraid. My mother said she needed to talk to me. I said, "I'm listening." She did not come inside. I did not invite them in. We spoke through the open door, which was not how any of them had planned this, I could tell, because the choreography of the intervention requires a kitchen table and a certain amount of herding, and I was declining to be herded. She said I had humiliated the family. I said I had stated facts in a room where facts were appropriate. She said no one in that room needed to hear our family business. I said I had decided differently, and that was a decision I was entitled to make. Dennis spoke, which surprised me. Dennis rarely speaks in these situations. He leaves the air management to my mother, and said that whatever I felt I was owed, this was not the way families handled things. I looked at him and I said, "Dennis, with respect, you have been in this family for 25 years, and you have never once said to my mother that she was treating me differently from Danielle. Not once. I want you to think about whether you are the right person to tell me how families handle things." He put his hands back in his pockets and looked at the porch railing. Danielle said, "Riley, I didn't know how much it was." She sounded genuine. She is, in her way, genuine. That is both her saving quality and the thing that makes it complicated. Because genuine ignorance of an injustice you benefited from is not the same as innocence, but it is not quite the same as malice either. And the distinction lives in that uncomfortable in-between where you cannot be simply angry. I said, "I believe you didn't track it, but you also didn't ask." She absorbed that. Her arms dropped a little. I could see her working something out behind her eyes, and I thought, she is going to be different after this. Not fixed, different. That's the most you can hope for. My mother tried one more angle, the oldest one. "I did everything for this family. I worked, I kept this family together, and this is what I get from you." I let the sentence finish. Then I said, "Mom, you don't treat me like a daughter. You haven't for years. You don't treat the money I give you like it comes from love. You treat it like it comes from a budget line. And when I made a mistake, or got the smaller thing, or sat at the table where the cake wasn't homemade, you didn't explain, and you didn't apologize. You just moved on. And you're still doing that right now." Pause. "I love you. I'm going to close this door now." I closed the door. Not a slam. There is nothing to prove in a slammed door. A soft click that says, "This is where the conversation ends, at my discretion, in a house that belongs to me." I stood on the inside of the closed door. My hands were trembling. I noticed with some detachment, the way you notice weather from a window. The trembling lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped. I heard the cars start. I heard them back out of the driveway. I went to the kitchen and Marcus handed me a glass of water without being asked. I drank it standing at the sink, looking at the backyard, where Chester was catching a stick and Emma was laughing and the October light was going amber on the fence posts. I went to the back door and called Emma in. She came in still laughing, Chester galloping beside her, and she said, "Is everything okay?" I said, "Yes, everything's actually okay." She looked at me with the assessing seriousness of 8-year-olds and apparently decided I was telling the truth because she went back to the living room and turned on the television. Later that night, after Emma went home and dinner was quiet and Chester was asleep on his favorite end of the couch, I sat beside Marcus and I said, "You should know that none of that was impulsive." He said, "I know." I said, "I want you to know anyway." He said, "I know that too." We watched television for a while, and then we didn't, and we just sat in the quiet that is a different kind of quiet than the dinner table quiet, the kind that belongs to you rather than being imposed on you. And it was, honestly, one of the better evenings I can remember. The calls from the extended family tapered off within 2 weeks. Some of them required a second brief conversation, a restatement of facts, a polite but definitive end to the discussion. One of them, my Aunt Patricia, called back 3 days after her first call, having apparently spoken to Vera and possibly re-examined a few things, and said, slightly uncomfortably, "Well, I didn't know the full picture." I said, "That's understandable." She said, "Still, she shouldn't have said that at dinner." I said, "No, she shouldn't have." We talked about her garden for a few minutes, which is extensive and genuinely impressive, and then we hung up, and that was that. The months that followed had a texture I hadn't anticipated, which was ordinary, not triumphant, not punishing, not charged with the residue of conflict, just days. Marcus and I had the kitchen recocked, which we had been meaning to do for 18 months. I promoted someone on my team at work, a junior coordinator named Luis, who had been doing senior work without senior recognition, which I recognized because I have personal familiarity with that situation. Chester got a new bed, a plush orthopedic one that he regarded with deep suspicion for 2 weeks before accepting it fully and completely, as if he had always had it. The money I had been sending south for 9 years stayed in my accounts. I did not spend it dramatically or celebrate its return. What I did was look at it, in the banking app, at the beginning of each month when the transfer date passed without a deduction, and note that it was still there. That small noting was its own kind of satisfaction. Quiet, internal, belonging only to me. By the third month, I had enough saved for the trip to Scotland that Marcus and I had been talking about for years. We booked it. We went in June. It rained almost every day, and the light on the hills was something I did not have the vocabulary for. And we came back with photographs that look like other people's photographs of Scotland, and memories that do not look like anything except ours. I found out what happened to my mother's household the way I find out most things about my mother's household. Through the family network, which is porous in the way of all family networks, leaky with information even when it is trying to be sealed. My Aunt Patricia mentioned in one of our now occasional calls that Carol had taken on some part-time bookkeeping work for a dentist's office on the east side of town. Dennis had picked up weekend shifts at the hardware store where he'd worked 20 years ago. They had moved to a smaller apartment. Still in Cloverfield, still decent, just smaller. They managed. That is the thing about this that I want to be precise about, because precision matters here. They managed. They were always capable of managing. The architecture of the arrangement I had been sustaining was not built on incapacity. It was built on preference. It was preferable to have me in the system, sending the transfers, absorbing the costs, available to be listed as the billing contact on a venue invoice. It was more comfortable. Comfortable arrangements do not reveal their true nature until someone declines to maintain them. Then you find out whether they were necessary or just convenient. This one was convenient. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it with something closer to relief, which is the emotion I had not expected and which arrived with the quiet stubbornness of something that was always true and just needed room to breathe. She had not been drowning. She had been choosing not to swim because there was someone else in the water doing it for her. There is still love inside all of it. I know that is the thing that confuses people. The idea that love and injustice can coexist in the same family, in the same parent, over the same decades. But they can. My mother loves me. She has always loved me in her particular, limited, unsatisfying way, the way someone loves a thing they have also been taking for granted. The love is real. It does not make the rest of it acceptable. These two things are both true. I have stopped needing them not to be. The phone call that surprised me most came 8 months after the wedding. It was Danielle, not calling on behalf of my mother, not calling as a messenger, calling in her own voice at a time my mother didn't know about, with the slightly uncertain tone of someone who has been working themselves up to something for a while. She said, "I've been thinking about the dress, about all of it." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have asked. I should have noticed you were carrying it." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Is it too late to say I'm sorry?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "No, it's not too late, but sorry is the beginning, not the end." She said she knew that. She sounded like she meant it. We talked for 40 minutes. It was the longest, honest conversation Danielle and I had had since we were children, before the system we were part of had fully formed us into our respective roles. She told me things I didn't know. That she had been uncomfortable at the Sweet 16 party. That she remembered standing at the car with the red bow and feeling, beneath the genuine excitement, a small and nameless wrong. She had not known what to do with that feeling. She had filed it somewhere her mother couldn't see and moved forward because moving forward was what the family did. I told her I believed her. I told her we could try something different from here. I did not make promises about what that would look like because I have learned that promises made in a phone call need to be tested in the actual texture of time before they mean anything. But it was a beginning. Brett, it turned out, was paying close attention to all of this. Brett has a sister of his own who got the smaller thing for years while he got the bigger thing. And he had been raised with a dim but persistent guilt about that, and watching what happened at his own wedding reception had apparently accelerated some kind of reckoning. He had sat down with Danielle after the reception, and they had had a very long conversation. They were seeing a couples therapist, not because their marriage was in trouble, but because Brett said he wanted to make sure they didn't pass certain patterns forward. I found this enormously hopeful, which surprised me, because I had not been expecting to find things enormously hopeful for a while. The conversation with my mother happened in late spring, about 10 months after the wedding. Not a planned conversation. She called on a Sunday afternoon. at a time that felt tentative, and asked if I was available to talk. I said yes. The first few minutes were careful, both of us navigating something that had never had a map. Then she said, "I want to tell you something." I waited. She said, "My mother did this, the same thing, to me and to my brother. He got everything." The way she said it, quiet, slightly flat, the tone of something stated rather than performed. I believed her. I believed she was telling the truth about something she had never said out loud, possibly to anyone. I said, "I believe you, and I know that matters, but knowing it doesn't undo what happened. It just means we can both choose what comes next." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." 2 words, quiet, real, carrying about 40 years' worth of things she didn't know how to say. That was enough. I did not need the full speech. Real accounting rarely arrives in full speeches. It arrives in 2 words, on a Sunday afternoon, in the particular tone that tells you someone is finally talking about the thing rather than around it. She mentioned, near the end of the call, that she had made an appointment. She didn't use the word therapist. She said someone to talk to, which is the circumlocution people use when they are taking a step but are not ready to name it fully. I said I was glad. She said she wasn't sure it would help. I said, "It probably will. You just have to keep going after the first session where nothing happens." She laughed. A real laugh, not the deployed one, a surprise sound she seemed mildly embarrassed by. I told her I'd talk to her next week. I meant it. The family is not fixed. Let me be plain about that. Fixed implies a restored original state, and I am not sure the original state was ever good enough to want restored. What the family is different. The way something is different after a fracture sets. Stronger at the break, yes, but aching in certain weather, carrying the evidence of what happened inside the structure itself, visible on imaging if you know what to look for. We have dinners occasionally now, my mother and Dennis and Danielle and Brett and Marcus and me, and they are not easy dinners. They are dinners with history at the table, but they are honest in a way the old ones never were. And honesty, even at the price of discomfort, is worth something real. My mother has tested the rule once. I had told her in one of our early post-wedding calls, calmly and without ceremony, "If you start comparing what you give me to what you give Danielle, or vice versa, or if you start implying that what I do is less than what Danielle does, I'm going to say I love you and hang up." She had received this as information. And then, in a call about 6 weeks later, the language had started drifting in that familiar direction. Something about how it's just easier with Danielle. And I had said, "Mom, I love you," and I had hung up. She called back 4 minutes later. That call was better. It was shorter and more careful and more honest. It did not include the comparison. We have been building on those calls ever since. I keep the bus pass in the top drawer of my desk at home. The original one? Not a current one. It's years expired. The one from the winter I was 16, which I found when I was moving apartments at 22 and put in a box and eventually put in the desk, for reasons I didn't fully understand at the time. It is a laminated rectangle, dark blue with the County Transit logo on the front, my name printed in the small type of a municipal ID system that did not make room for personalities. Riley Brown, Route 7, Route 12, unlimited monthly. Valid from November Wart. I have never been able to throw it away. Not out of bitterness, I want to be specific about this, but because of what it represents, which is not the injustice, but the girl. The girl who stood at the bus stop at 5:45 in the morning in January with ice on the shelter roof and a coffee in a travel mug she'd bought with her own money from the coffee shop where she worked. Going to the coffee shop where she worked, building a future with materials that had not been provided to her. That girl was unbroken. She did not know she was doing something remarkable. She was just going to work. But remarkable things are often the ones that don't announce themselves. I think about what I earned. Not what I was given. What I earned. The apartment at 22, the job at the firm at 24, the promotion at 27, the house with the yellow shutters in Cloverfield, Ohio, the savings account I call by a number rather than a name because I've decided money works better when it's not emotional, the Scotland trip, the orthopedic dog bed, the 7 years with Marcus. I earned those things. Not alone. Marcus was alongside. Nana Lou was behind me the whole time. Vera checked in. Luis at work makes my days better. but earned nonetheless in the particular sense of nobody handed me the receipt and said, "This is yours." I took the receipt, I kept the receipt. I am the receipt. The car I drive is a 7-year-old Subaru Outback in a green called Wilderness Green, which is a shade that changes depending on the light and looks almost blue in shadow. I bought it with a down payment I had been saving for 3 years, which is to say, I bought it in 2021 and drove it off the lot and sat in the parking lot of the dealership for about 4 minutes, just sitting in the car that was mine, looking at the steering wheel that was mine, listening to the quiet of the car that was mine, before driving home. There was no red bow. I did not need one. Now I want to talk to you, not about my family specifically, about you, about the child you were, in whatever house you grew up in whatever family had its own version of the rules that applied to you more than to others, the birthday that was smaller, the bedroom that was last on the list, the accomplishment that got nodded at while the other one got the party, the "you've always been so independent" that was not actually a compliment, and you knew it even then, even at 8 years old, even at 12, even at 17, sitting in the car on the way home from another dinner where the camera found your sibling before it found you. I want to say something clearly, because I don't think anyone has said it to you directly. You were not easy to love. I know that is what they told you. I know it has a way of sounding kind, even admirable. You've always been so easy. You've always needed so little. You've always been so strong. And I know you learned to accept it as a kind of distinction, a thing that set you apart in a positive way, because accepting it as a positive was easier than examining what it actually meant. But I want you to hear the other version, the truer version. You were not easy to love. You were easy to overlook. And those are not the same thing. Being easy to overlook is not a quality of the person being overlooked. It is a quality of the people doing the overlooking. It is their failure of attention, their failure of imagination, their failure of the basic moral arithmetic that says, if I am doing this for one, I should ask whether I am doing it for all. You did not earn your smallness. It was assigned to you. You wore it for years because it was the uniform of survival in that particular household. And you were a child. And children wear what they are handed and believe what they are told about themselves for longer than we like to admit. The smile at the dinner table when the unequal thing happened. I know that smile. I know the precise work it takes to produce it. I know the calculation that runs underneath. If I react, it gets worse. If I cry, I'm being dramatic. If I say something, I'm ungrateful. If I just smile, maybe everyone will move on and I can process this alone later in my room. Which I will. And then I will get up the next morning and go to school and not mention it. Because not mentioning it is the price of belonging in this family. I know that smile. You should know that smiling through it was not weakness. It was strategy. It was how you survived an environment that had not earned your tears. You were paying attention the whole time, even when they thought you weren't, especially when they thought you weren't. The child who gets less watches more. You watched the table. You watched who got the longer hug. You watched which drawings went on the refrigerator and which ones got moved aside to make room. You watched which report cards got framed and which ones got good job, and then the same refrigerator shuffle. You were building an inventory, not out of bitterness, not yet, but out of the perfectly reasonable need to understand the world you were living in. That inventory is not paranoia. That inventory is perception. And perception, in the long run, is the most useful thing you were given in that house, even if no one intended to give it to you. There was someone who saw you. I want to ask about that person because they exist in almost every version of this story I have ever heard. The teacher who kept you after class, not because you were in trouble, but because she had noticed you were careful with your sentences, and she wanted to encourage that. The grandparent who drove 40 minutes on the days that mattered, and whose house smelled a specific way, and who never once made you feel like a secondary item on a list. The neighbor who waved every morning like it was important, like you were worth waving at, which is such a small thing and which went so far. I had Nana Lou, 40 minutes south on Perkins Street, cedar and orange-scented hand lotion. Opinion stated without apology. She is the reason I know what it feels like to be seen by a person who has decided you are worth seeing. No asterisk, no conditions, no sliding scale. If you had someone like that, Hold on to them. And if you are that person for someone else, please know. What you're doing matters more than you can possibly calculate. The current relationship with my mother is not a reconciliation. I want to be precise. A reconciliation implies a return to a prior state, and the prior state was not somewhere I want to return to. What we have is something we are building from the current position, which is honest and occasionally uncomfortable and more real than what came before it. She has been seeing the someone she goes to talk to on Tuesday afternoons. She does not tell me much about those conversations, which I respect. What I notice is that our phone calls are shorter and more careful, which sounds like a diminishment, but actually is not. Shorter and more careful means she is thinking before she speaks, which she did not used to do with me. She is thinking about what she says to me. That is a form of respect she is learning at 61, which is late but not never. I have one rule for our conversations. If the old pattern appears, the comparative language, the implication that one of us needs more consideration than the other, the drift toward the comfortable, familiar geography of our old dynamic. I say, "Mom, I love you," and I hang up, not as a punishment, as a boundary. The difference is important, and I need her to know the difference. And I think, slowly, she is learning it. She tested it once. I executed. She called back. The conversation was better. It's not a perfect family, it's a different one. And different is enough. Last November, I drove to Nana Lou's house on Perkins Street for the Sunday before Thanksgiving, the way I do most years, with a pie from the bakery on Route 9, and Chester in the back seat with his head out the window in a manner that is technically unsafe and practically non-negotiable. We sat at her kitchen table for 3 hours. She made the soup she makes, white bean, with a heel of bread she tears instead of cuts. And we talked about the Scotland trip, which she wanted to hear about in detail. The specific detail of someone who has decided not to travel, but wants very much to know what is out there. I told her about the rain. I told her about the light on the hills. She nodded at the light on the hills. At some point I went to help with the dishes, and I found, sitting on the counter beside the soap dispenser, a small keyring with my name on a paper tag tied with kitchen twine. The handwriting was hers, the old-fashioned looping kind, the kind that doesn't exist much anymore. The tag said, "Riley, the side gate, always open for you." It was the key to her side gate, which she had told me years ago was always unlocked, which means the key was not practical. It was symbolic in the way that the things that matter most are always a little symbolic. I stood at the sink and held it for a moment, the paper tag soft between my fingers, the handwriting she has had my entire life. I put it on my key ring, between the house key and the car key, where I see it every day. If my younger self had a key, any key, to any place that meant she was welcome, that is the thing I would have given her. Not the car with the bow, not the party with the banner, not the speech she wasn't allowed to give. Just a key. Just the knowledge that somewhere a door was open for her unconditionally, without a list of rules for who qualified and who didn't. That is the whole story. That is what I did and why I did it and what came after. I want to ask you 2 things in the comments, and I will actually read them. Not skim, read, because I have been reading comments like these for long enough to know that the stories people share there are the realest writing the internet produces. First, was there someone in your family who saw you when the main people didn't? Tell me who they were. I want to know. Second, if you were sitting at that dinner table when my mother announced I wasn't allowed to speak, what would you have done? I'm genuinely curious. I've been thinking about what other people would have done in that chair. If you think I was right to stand up at that microphone, if you've been the one at the table where the camera found everyone else first, then your like is how you say it. That is what it means. Not algorithm, not engagement metrics, not the usual. Just, I see what this was, and I think it was right. And subscribe. Not because I post all the time, but because there is a next chapter. What happened at Christmas 2 months after the wedding, which involved a moment my mother apparently had not planned for, and which I have been told by 3 separate people was the moment things actually shifted. You will want to see it. I promise it is quieter than the wedding. Quiet things, sometimes, are the ones that change everything. She announced it at the dinner table, and 2 weeks later I went to the microphone anyway. That's the thing about being silenced for a long time. When you finally speak, you know exactly what to say, and you do not need anyone's permission to say it. Not anymore.